The animation window is the primary window when working with animations. It gives us the ability to preview, adjust, and manage our animations. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. We can easily get to one by simply opening up any of our animation sequences. If we go back into our content, mannequin, animations folder, any of these assets with the underscore, which is green, this little green at the bottom of it, and it says animation sequence at the top, will allow us to open up the animation window. Let's look at the idle. We'll go ahead and dock it to the top. And here we go. We have our animation window. We're going to go ahead and look at the different parts of it and the more important things we need to know when working with the animation window. And the key here is this is where we kind of get to mess with and adjust our animations, preview them, and make sure everything's working good once they've gotten into the engine. So looking at our toolbar, we have some pretty simple options. We have our preview mesh. If you have a different mesh for this skeletal setup, you can change it here. You have the ability to quickly create any assets based on this skeletal setup. So at this point, let's say we've brought in a mesh. We have some animations. We want to set up our blueprint. We can go ahead and create a blueprint here really quickly. We have the ability to re-import animation. Now I'm going to cover this in more detail in a second, but note that when you click re-import animation, by default, it's going to try to go ahead and find the existing animation. So if you've already imported once, it knows where the animation was at. And if not, it's going to ask you to find it again because you may have moved it. In this case, this was included with the Epic content and I don't have the original source, so I can't re-import. We have some compression settings, some exporting settings if we want to export out, and then the ability to turn this into a static mesh. Maybe if we find a pose we want to turn to a static mesh, maybe as a statue or something out of a skeletal mesh. On the left, we have our skeleton tree. This matches our basic skeleton, just like if we chose a skeleton over here, so we can quickly reference it. And our asset details. We're going to cover that in more detail in a second. On the right, we have details about what maybe we have selected inside of our viewport. In this case, if I have a bone selected, we can see the information about it. Preview scene settings is where we can change the viewport preview. So we could change it to maybe a specific pose or animation, change the background and lighting. We're just going to keep this as the default. At the bottom, we have our animation timeline. This is where we can see the animation playing back, as well as anything specific to it. Notifies, curves, additive layer tracks, blends, things like that. And on the bottom right, we have our asset browser. This will show us all of the animations that are currently available to us for the skeleton that we are working with. You could, for example, have 3 or 4 different skeletons. You're only going to see the animations that are applicable for what you currently have up. So the other comparable and compatible ones. So let's take a look at our asset details. So inside of here, this is the third-person idle animation that I have loaded up. We can see things like if we're retargeting, if we have retargeting manager set up. We can see the different animation track names or the different bones basically that are being animated inside of this animation. We can see what type of interpolation it has, where you can adjust it if you want linear or stepping. The rate scale, how fast does this animation play back? Normal speed, 1.0. Faster would be a higher number like 2. Lower would be a fractional number like 0.5. As well as which skeleton, assets, and mapping tables we might be using. In this case, this is our mannequin skeleton assigned to this animation. Below this, you have some additive animation settings. We're not going to cover those in this course, but if you're using additive animations, this is where you'd set them up. We have some compression settings. By default, it's going to go ahead and try to compress your animation. You might run into artifacts, for example, depending on how your animation is set up. So you could always adjust this here. If we're using root motion, we are not in this case. Our root is going to be stuck at the bottom of our character. If we go to character, bones, all hierarchy, and we zoom into the bottom, we'll go to our skeleton tree and we will choose the root bone. You can see it here. And if we scrub through our animation, you'll notice our root doesn't change. But if you do have root motion, you have the ability to enable it here and change its settings. Now below this, we have our import settings. And our transform section technically applies to import as well. You'll see it says import, import, import. It's just in a different header. If we click show advanced, we have a bunch of options. If you are using your own animations brought in from a third-party program, when you bring it in, you're going to get some import options, and those are all of these settings here. These exist so that way you can adjust them and then re-import the character and then maybe see what happens. One of the main ones that you may need to do is you bring in your character and you find it's too high or too low. Something went wrong. It needs to be offset. Well, you have your import translations and rotations here. One issue though is these are on import only. So once it's already in your system, you can't just adjust these. Let's say I want it to be higher and have it work. You have to adjust these settings and then re-import the animation, and these settings will take effect once you've re-imported your animation. So keep that in mind. Below this, we have some miscellaneous things. These are more related to import. We have, for example, where it came from, any metadata, and then our thumbnail on the outside. The key things when working with your animation are going to be your different additive settings, your track names, retargeting sources. For the most part, if you're just simply bringing in existing animations at work, you should be able to ignore most of the asset details. What you're going to care about is more of your playback track at the bottom. And our animation timeline controls what basically happens while your animation is playing back. In this case, you can see as I scrub through it, we can drag the bar at the top. We can scrub through 0 all the way to the end. We can see our animation playing back in our viewport. We can see any notifies that might be fired off. We're not going to cover notifies in this course, but notifies are great because they can communicate with your blueprint. For example, you may have a walk. Let's say we have our walk playing. You'll notice a foot may go down at this point and a foot may go down at this point. And we can have an animation notify that says, hey, animation blueprint, I've put my foot down. Maybe you want to do something. And the animation blueprint may go, oh, yes. Why don't we play a sound every time they put their foot down? And you can link things together like that. These are for morph targets or blend shapes for your curves. For example, you might have something growing or shrinking and using a morph target, and you can see it here on your curves. And additive layer tracks are when we want to adjust these animations in the engine and layer on some changes. So that way we can adjust it without using our third-party program. When we create our custom animation for later, we're going to be using the additive layer tracks. And of course, in your asset browser, you can simply double-click on any of these animations to switch back and forth. At the bottom, you have things such as fast forwarding, rewinding, recording your own animation based on what you're doing inside the engine, scrubbing back and forth. If you hold down the Control key and use your mouse wheel, that allows you to zoom in and out of your timeline. You can also adjust what frame rate and sections you see at the bottom and scrub back and forth. That is the basics of our animation window that you use when you want to work with your animation sequences inside of Unreal Engine.